he's like a rich Hollywood producer version of a
Yeah,
sovereign citizen, right?
yeah.
Like he's got stock holdings, he's got a summer house, he has the resources to kind of LARP as a sovereign citizen, but I don't know if he's really got it in him to live like the true Jordan Maxwell, no license plate, I'm traveling, I'm not driving, all of that. I don't know if he was made for that life, but he's kind of showing you like the rich person's version of it.
Under the docks, yeah, under the docks. Buried deeper, we're breaking the locks. Footage got clipped, they erased all the shots. They connected dots. Under the docks, under the docks, yeah, under the docks.
America, Freedom to Fascism, 2006. This is written and directed and narrated by Aaron Russo. If you don't know who this is, he was a producer of Trading Spaces. He had worked on a whole bunch of different projects with Bette Midler. He kind of had some Hollywood credentials. He also had a failed candidacy as governor for Nevada, which explains some of his political connections and the way that he's able to get some of the interviews in this particular movie. To kind of summarize this entire movie, America, Freedom to Fascism, this is about Aaron Russo originally setting out to make a documentary about whether or not there was a law requiring Americans to pay the federal income tax. That was the main goal that he started out with. And as he starts looking into this, a lot of the familiar names start popping up, the Rockefellers and the Morgans and Jekyll Island and all of the different financial conspiracy theories start to pop up. And this is the first time that he kind of runs into these. But then he digs a little bit deeper using his connections in Hollywood and in DC. And it turns into this a little bit overarching storyline about America was taken over by these bankers and is being led directly into literal fascism. Not 2025, everyone's a fascist style, but like true economic. And he kind of defines it as this new wave of corporatism. So that is the overall premise of this. It kind of has collections of what we've seen so far. We've seen Money Masters. We've seen Zeitgeist takes a stab at the banking industry. A few of these different ones. This one kind of recaps some of this, but it absolutely laser focus on the 16th Amendment, and it focused on exactly what the IRS does, how it works, and where all the money goes. So if you want to get angry at the IRS and about how taxes are spent, this is the absolute perfect documentary to do that.
I already hated taxes, and I'm midway through it, and you're like, "Yeah, I'm watching." I'm like, "I'm already at a level 10, man. I'm marching to the IRS because I already hate the term of it." And this really fills in a lot of the blanks of some of the things that people have been saying for the last 10, 15 years. I think a lot of it came from this. Like, you got Money Masters kind of put in the little seeds, and now you're seeing the roots come out and the actual branches blossom. And Russo does a good job of using his connections, like you said, to get some really good interviews and put people on the spot that we would love to see on a regular basis, but you don't usually get to see that because you're associated. Like, you're not going to see someone like Jones or like David Icke getting to get some of these prominent figures because they're more looked as a conspiracy theorist. Or Russo was actually like, "Hey, I'm a filmmaker. This is what I'm trying to do." And the way he kind of got them, he didn't sucker them, but they were kind of lost in the glitz and glams of Hollywood, if you will.
Yeah, there are a number of people that are saying, "I was not prepared for this," or "I can't believe you're doing this, Aaron." So you know that he pulled and he burnt some bridges by getting some of these interviews on tape. A lot of people that went back home that night, they're like, "That guy's not invited to Bohemian Grove next encampment." All right, let's plot the course. Here's some of the key claims that this particular documentary makes. The first one is that banks took over the United States in roughly 1913. Specifically, that in 1913, America was free, but then gets taken over by J.P. Morgan, Paul Warburg, John D. Rockefeller, and Woodrow Wilson. That first they convinced this guy, Philander Knox, to lie to Americans. And this guy was, side note, a member of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club right above Jonestown, which was the site of one of the first national disasters handled by the Red Cross. That won't come up later, but it is one of my favorite sort of tangent conspiracy theories. So some other day we'll get into that one. That senators were bribed to pass this Federal Reserve Act during Christmas vacation. They waited for most people to be at home with their families, and they just sneak this thing through and get it signed into law without a whole lot of pushback because of that. And then here's a quote from Woodrow Wilson that says, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by a system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government of the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." And let me reiterate, that is President Woodrow Wilson saying this, I believe on his deathbed or close to it. So if you don't want to take the president's word for it that the government was completely taken over in 1913 by this group of bankers, I don't have any other better source to really provide.
Yeah, and a lot of those claims too, like you could tell the feel of the movie. I mean, and G. Edward Griffin is, quite a bit in the movie as well. But Creature of Jekyll Isle is really what someone read that book and then was like, well, Russo obviously, and then he's like, you know what, I need to make this film, and that really, you could tell that was the starting catalyst for everything he was trying to get in this film.
The second major claim is that the income tax, which came from the 16th Amendment, also from 1913, was never ratified, and therefore it's not a real law. And some of the specifics, that there is no law forcing Americans to provide a 1040 to the IRS. This is your income tax form. No law in the books that actually says you have to do that. That the IRS does not even define what the word income means. So therefore, the entire premise of the income tax is null and void because they don't even define their own terms. Again, these are key points made by this documentary. It has a quote from a U.S. District Court Judge James C. Fox from 2003, and he says, Supreme Court Justice says, if you examine the 16th Amendment, you would find that states never ratified that amendment. It's got interviews with IRS agents, a guy named John Turner, a guy named Joe Bannister, a chick named Sheri Jackson, all three of them actual IRS agents that looked into this and all resigned from their positions in the IRS, according to them, because they couldn't handle the deception against Americans, and that this was their entire job. And that a lot of this was being pushed by this group called We the People Foundation, which, by the way, I looked into it. Their website hasn't been updated since 2012, so I don't know how active this particular march is still going. But that's the key premise, is that the IRS, the income tax, the 1040, is not even a real law.
Yeah, that's the main theme throughout, like most of the movie is they're trying to figure out, is this a law or not? And when you speak of the IRS agents that resigned, the funny thing is, it's that typical of like, well, more they were trying to debunk it, that this could not be, right? Like, I'm going to figure this out, like what dummies they are, that they don't know that there's a law. I'm going to find the specific law or point. And they all came to the same conclusion that there is none. And I was even like, as I'm going through it, I'm like, yeah, where is it? And I'm looking for stuff. And there's a lot of like things that could be out there that kind of like speculate, or your interpretation of it, right? Like I could say, well, I'm interpreting like this, but there's no actual law. Like There's things that they make an argument about it, and during the time where they're talking about murder, and it's like, but there's a law against murder, and I think they even make one about a red light and a green light. Like, well, I would, I think it was Cohen, maybe he's talking about like, if it's a red light, I'm going to stop. Most people stop. Russo makes a joke like, hey, sometimes I don't, and he's like, well, I will, and he's like. Then Russo pauses it and he gets to interject and he goes, but there is a law that tells you have to stop at a red light. Like, I can point to you that. So I thought that argument, they argued it very well. They convinced me. It didn't take much convincing, but they did convince me.
Yeah, if you loved income tax before you see this documentary, I'm sorry to break your heart, but you might not like it as much. And just to really drive this one home, that last IRS agent that I mentioned, her name was Sheri Jackson. And that one was the most fascinating to me because she comes across this full page ad in the USA Today, July 7th, 2000. It was called the $50,000 challenge. And all it said, this full page ad in the USA Today, that if you can find the law that says where you have to file for taxes, you win $50,000. She comes across this and she thinks to herself, I'm smart. I'm in the IRS. I've heard this, over and over. Let's kill two birds with one stone. Let's put this whole stupid, silly myth to rest, and let's get me $50K to go and buy mama a new car, right? How easy could that be? She could go to work and just look up all the stuff. And after a few months of looking, she just never found any of that and becomes a member of this movement to sort of just stop paying income tax.
Yeah, that was probably the most profound part of on any of the agents, because her whole premise was to try to debunk it.
The next claim is kind of a short one. I don't have a whole lot of subclaims for this one, but just that fascism is really corporations working with government, and that all the different political definitions, whatever baggage you're bringing in, this is how Aaron Russo is defining to this term of fascism, is just corporations and government working together to stifle people, individuals. And that is the crux of this, that a lot of the claims they make, they sort of explain that corporate tax is the one tax that's meant to pay for wars, and that if you want to worry about highways, well, that comes from direct taxes from gasoline and car sales and every other thing, excise taxes, or if you want to buy alcohol or cigarettes, that all of these things are taxed directly. But that when corporations work with the government to say, well, let's just collect tax on the people and get that to kind of pay off some other things, that is this entry point to fascism. It's a little bit novel based on other definitions I've heard from fascism. This is a very uniquely Aaron Russo way to look at it, I think. But that is one of the main claims. And if that's his definition of it, I would say that, yeah, his title of America, Freedom to Fascism kind of hits the mark.
It's kind of a classical liberal point of view, not like maybe now in 2025, the progressive class, but a classic liberal kind of sees it, the fascism of corporatism taking over, and that tax. And as you talk about the tax, I think like the interpretation of voluntary compliance in the tax code is also what they're kind of talking about in that, where they're saying, like, when you talked about gains and profits, of what are we able to tax? Are we able to tax the gains and profits? Or are we able to tax the labor? And that's one of the main arguments that's combined in that.
And there's also the last claim that I kind of think that they were pushing forward was that there's going to be a new wave of these real ID cards and of RFID chips. And if Aaron Russo was a heavily religious man, I would almost tack on Mark of the Beast here. That doesn't come up, but it's essentially that premise that every other note that comes up from 1913 all the way to, the Patriot Act in 2001 was that it's moving everyone to get shipped, to voluntarily become part of the system where we can all be tracked as a matter of security. And that this is ultimately part of the main goals of these small groups of bankers, that they're trying to move everyone into this sort of corporate fascistic new reality. That is one of the other real big claims. And it's so big that at the end of the movie, it kind of ends with a few slides that are saying, do not get the chip, resist the chip, don't take the real ID. If you have to go and get your driver's license and it's got real ID, refuse to take your driver's license. So it is very adamant about this particular point.
And one point I would just like to add to that, kind of like piggybacks off what you're talking. They also speak a lot on the electronic voting machines becoming like an issue, and it's just kind of funny going back now. You know what I mean? Like all the voter fraud stuff, and you've heard it for the last like 15 years. And he was kind of like one of the first people that I can think of that going back. This is 2006, and he's talking about these voting machines and how this will help them keep the key people and the bankers people in office.
And it's worth noting here too that Aaron Russo died 1 year after this documentary was released. Of course, on the internet, you'll find claims of suspicious deaths and everything, but officially he died of cancer. And even if there's nothing suspicious about his death, which I don't necessarily think there is, it is prophetic that some of the claims that he was making kind of have already came and went. It's already too late to protest some of these things because they have already happened.
Yeah. And maybe to your point too, if that's why this film was so important to him. Maybe he already knew that he was diagnosed with something that was going to lead to this, and that kind of pushes into the film a little bit, I think.
That's actually a great point. Maybe this is what let him burn some of those bridges. Like, well, I'm not going to need to call this guy in a year from now.
I'll be gone.
Now, this documentary's got a few different hidden treasures. The big ones for me, and I'm going to be biased in this one, actual interviews with G. Edward Griffin, the author of Creature from Jekyll Island, the OG, the first guy to really put his stamp on this particular topic about 1913 and the Warburgs and the Rockefellers and the Titanic sinking. Although this movie doesn't get too deep into all those Titanic theories too, this is where all that comes from. This is like the fountainhead, which a lot of those streams sort of derive from. We also learn a lot about the origins of the IRS and the income tax. And I think that just learning about that, even if you don't mean to, by watching this, you'll learn a little bit. And that's an incredibly worthy cause, more so than a lot of other, quote, conspiracy topics. This one is legit. Like, you're actually learning where it was defined, when it was defined, how the law was passed. These are objective statements about our shared reality. These are not conjecture. So I think that alone makes this sort of hidden gem. They also make a push in an indirect way, but the same people that are kind of pushing you to look into income tax, it kind of dovetails with jury nullification, which I'm a huge fan of. I won't get too much deeper into that, but it definitely pushes a lot of these premises of jury nullification, which I love. And then finally, unlike, I would say 99%, and I can just make up percentages because that's what percentages are for. So 99% of other conspiracy themed documentaries, a lot of them just kind of rile you up, or they leave these unanswered questions as if that's part of the allure to conspiracy. But this one suggests very concise and direct actions that they suggest that you take. These are the ones that they suggest: engage in civil disobedience, to take part in strikes and protests, to not accept a national ID card, even if it's your driver's license, and to abolish computer voting. I don't know how much any of us can do about that last one. And I don't know how many people are just like, you know what? I'm not going to have a driver's license. I don't need to drive a car ever again. I don't need to use the airport or get onto a plane or a train or a boat or, travel ever again for the rest of my life. I don't need to buy a lottery ticket or cigarettes or get prescription medication or get a job. Like, what this is sort of advocating for a full-blown sovereign citizen, which is only for a very tiny, minute number of people that decide to willingly withdraw themselves from the rest of society. But these are the hidden gems, is that it presents all of these things to you.
And I thought some of the hidden gems too. My favorite part of the movie is the interview with Sheldon Cohen, the former IRS commissioner and author of the tax code. It's one of the best. Like, I know it's not the full scene because they kind of go back to it later, but where he's pausing it and he gets to go, "Oh, really?" Or "Remember when we heard this?" I thought that was great. And he really left him flat-footed and he didn't have any answers and he kept putting his foot in his mouth. I thought that alone is worth the price of admission right there. That whole interview with him where he really got, it's one of those times where you're like, yeah, it feels like you're right there. Yeah, get him, man. Like where you're watching the bully get beat up, right? Like the guy that you've been wanting to see get punched in the face is finally getting it. And the way he articulated himself, Russo, you could tell he was getting under his skin, and he even wanted to end the interview. He's like, I've had enough. I'm not prepared. As you said, quite a few of these people were not prepared. Another thing that I thought was a gem was the Joe Louis story, where they kind of let everybody know that, like, look at this American hero that, liberals would say, hey, that has been through all this past, or like kind of going on the strings of like, hey, man, racial oppression. He was there for the World War II. He fought for his country and won, gold for his country. All these things, these accolades. And then he donates his check to the armed forces, and then he's taxed on it. Like he's taxed on it, and then he owes millions of dollars in debt, and he's trying to pay it off. And they even go as far as talking about when his mother died, and she gave him $600. All the money in her name, that the IRS took it from him. And I thought that was significant because you can present that to people and say, look, go look up Joe Louis. Do you think he's a great guy? Do you think he's an American? And look what happened to him. It's not your usual, like, this guy was a little shady or a sovereign citizen and he's trying to flex his rights. No, a guy that was trying to comply with everything was really took to the ringer. An American.
Right, and it wasn't like an Al Capone thing either, where they couldn't get him on racketeering or they couldn't get him on, drugs or anything else. So they had to resort to get him on taxes. Joe Louis earned all this money, donated it to the government, and then the IRS comes in and says, comes a knocking, and it's like, hey, you now owe everything to us for the rest of your life because you were supposed to send us a cut. You can't just give it directly to the government like that, which also in this documentary, they make a very good case that the IRS and the Federal Reserve is a private institution. This is not the government. So you can be on great terms with the government and still be on really bad terms with the IRS. And these two things are completely separate entities that in many cases are even antagonistic towards each other. The overboard parts, for me, the movie does a great job, although Aaron Russo relies more than he needs to on these man on the street interviews where he'll go up to people and be like, do you know where the taxes defined and the law and what tells you to do this? And like you mentioned earlier, murder is on the books, right? I've never actually looked at the state or the federal law that tells you are not allowed to murder or anything. I assume that it's in there. And I know that I've seen plenty of, news reports where people go to jail for murder. So it is in all, practical sense of reality, a law. And I feel kind of the same way about that, just because you haven't seen the exact law, which this movie unequivocally makes a great case of presenting that there's no law in the books that actually says you have to file or that defines any of this. But there's plenty of instances of people going to jail, real jail, shout out Wesley Snipes, for tax evasion. So whether or not it's, on a piece of paper that you can show someone versus the last century of us, of the country existing, it seems like it's been solidified into the law that matters, even if it's not the law that's on the books. So that part is a little bit murky. And then also he asked people like, if you didn't have to pay income tax, would you? Of course, every single person says no. I don't know what he's getting at. And then finally, he goes to the IRS building in DC and he kind of harasses the security guard. The security guard comes by and he's like, sir, you can't film here. And he's like, show me on the law where it says I can't film here. And then he's got to call the supervisor. And then eventually the cops come. And then, Aaron Russo probably is like, I've got important friends and I'm a rich guy. So they don't arrest him for that. But I don't really understand what point he was proving. If he had actually been sent to jail and like went through the whole system because of that, it would make a difference. But this one reminded me a little bit of the Trayvon Martin hoax documentary with Joe Gilbert, just going and adding unnecessary like B-roll just to kind of like make this point, to insert himself in this this bigger story.
So you're saying Russo kind of birthed the all these people that have their influencer audit the police channels, like, where they're filming, hey, I could be here, show me the law. That's kind of the feel you got from that when he's like, show me where I can't film. And
I think he's like a rich Hollywood producer version of a
Yeah.
sovereign citizen, right?
Yeah.
Like he's got stock holdings, he's got a summer house, he has the resources to kind of LARP as a sovereign citizen, but I don't know if he's really got it in him to live like the true Jordan Maxwell, no license plate, I'm traveling, I'm not driving, all of that. I don't know if he was made for that life, but he's kind of showing you like the rich person's version of it.
Yeah, yeah, the rich person. That's definitely the version of it. And also, I think one of the overboard moments is that, as you said about the law, even though as much as I hate income tax and as much as I hate the IRS, everything's left for interpretation, right? Like it's like where I have to like know there's no defined answer because it's like, how do you perceive what was written? What do you think of the 16th Amendment? And there's just this argument that I don't know if we could ever reach the middle ground because so many people have it made the line in the sand and say, hey, we're over here. We believe that you're not supposed to tax labor and you're only supposed tax gains and profit. And other people says any income whatsoever. And I don't know how you get over that barrier. That for me was one of the overboard moments, not necessarily the fault of the film. It's just the reality of like everything's interpreted. So how do you perceive it?
Well, actually, let's just read the entire 16th Amendment. It's not long, it's incredibly short. Here's the entirety of it. Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any consensus or enumeration. That's the entirety of the 16th Amendment. It says that Congress is allowed to collect taxes on incomes from any source without apportionment. And that without apportionment part is kind of important because there's a few other times in this documentary that other people on camera that he's interviewing are referring to why income tax is unconstitutional, because all other direct taxes have to be apportioned. And if you want to know what apportion means, it means that if you tax me $100, then I have to split that as the government. I have to take that $100 and divide it equally amongst all the people in the city, state, country, whatever the group is that tax represents. And without that apportionment, that it is now unconstitutional. Well, the amendment clearly says without apportionment. So that one kind of goes out the gate a little bit. So it doesn't really make that unconstitutional. And they make, I guess, the conventional explanation for this is that the 16th Amendment does not actually pass a new law that allows them to levy a tax. This already existed. The federal government was already allowed to issue that tax. What it does is it adds a little asterisk that now says without apportionment. So after the 16th Amendment, this means that in addition to taxing you, which they were already had the ability to do, now they no longer have to divide it up equally for any sort of social services, and they can just spend the money on whatever they want. So that, I mean, as short as it is, it has led to all sorts of debate. There's Supreme Court rulings that seem to contradict this. There's other amendments that seem to contradict it. But the truth is, if you don't pay your taxes, ask Wesley Snipes what happens, right? Federal agents show up and they repossess everything that you've got under gunpoint. So whether or not they can show it to you on a piece of paper versus are the feds coming for you? No and yes. All right, let's do the deep dive here. A lot of claims made in this documentary. It's about 2 hours long. Although one of the claims in particular felt like it was more fun to break down than the others. And this is that all of our income tax goes only to paying off the interest on the federal debt, and that not even a single nickel makes it into public services. So when you send in all the money for individual earnings across every single American, every single penny of that income tax only pays off the interest that the government is having to spend to the central banks for the privilege of using their fiat currency to begin with. That's kind of mind-blowing. I assume that income tax are supposed to go to funding a whole array of federal and state-based things. But this movie makes this very specific claim that I've got some deep dive on it. But when you heard that, like, did that make sense to you? Did you believe it outright? Did it seem that was a little far-fetched or what?
I felt like a little far-fetched as far as like I know it's being used for like to me, but that's my personal bias. I was thinking more like used for, and they dance around it, but like military use and stuff like that, like where they kind of talk a little. That's where the money's going. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the things in Washington in general, like a hot topic now is the Board of Education getting dismantled. But a lot of the things are just suggestions in general, right? Like we have, I don't know how much funding actually is needed for some of these things. And it would make sense with our infrastructure being a little shoddy as it is.
Well, so the source of that claim about all of our income tax money going directly to pay just the interest on the national debt, this comes from when Reagan was elected. When Reagan first got elected, he put together what they call a blue ribbon panel of a bunch of businessmen from across the country, headed by this guy named Peter Grace, who, as a side note, is the grandson of William Grace, who's the guy that received the freaking Statue of Liberty from France for New York. So, I mean, you know, some big names, not just some random guy. So this guy, Peter Grace, he kind of heads this little panel put together by the president, kind of like what Trump does too, right? He goes out and he gets businessmen and he puts together Doge, or he puts together these kind of like little groups. That's kind of what Reagan did here. And Peter Grace and this Grace Commission, they put together a report. They spend months researching, you know, where the income tax is going. Now, this is what's in the Grace Commission report. 100% of what is collected is absorbed solely by interest on the federal debt. All individual tax revenues are gone before one nickel is spent on the services that taxpayers expect from government. Unquote. That is the summary finding. Now, it could be biased, right? This is a group that Reagan puts together in his little inner circle of business people. And I'm sure that they want the income tax gone. But this was their finding, that not only is it inefficient and even unconstitutional, depending on your point of view, but objectively, all of the money is being spent entirely at this time in the 80s with Reagan on just paying the interest on the debt.
That would lead a lot more to the, like you said, freedom to fascism, right? That kind of rings a higher bell when you when you kind of put that perspective out there.
The movie also connected to all this, it kind of asks this question, and it does it in a way that conspiracy documentaries will usually leave an open-ended question as if it's making this point. But I'm going to answer this rhetorical question because that's what the deep dive is for. The question is, if you needed to tax income in order to fund the government and get government services, then how did the United States exist from 1776 to 1913? Because by those times, there was no federal income tax on individuals. So how the hell did the country exist for nearly 2 centuries? It's a good question. It's a good pointed question. And it makes you like, oh yeah, how did it? Well, here's the answer, right? First of all, in 1776, the United States was not the same amount of land, right? It was much smaller. It was like these 13 colonies. We didn't have the West expansion. We didn't have the Louisiana Purchase. Those things in particular end up funding money, right? The government's able to take land from other groups and then sell that to private businesses and make money off that sale. I mean, that's one hell of a way of making money. Have you ever heard of real estate? It's kind of like this big market, right? So the government just inheriting all of Texas, all of California, and then selling that to private industry and selling it to the railroads. That's one good way of raising some capital. Another one are excise taxes, right? The government actually did these. And ironically, the very first excise tax was on whiskey in 1791. And this is while George Washington is president. And even then, there was this huge whiskey rebellion. And people, like, it was a violent rebellion where now farmers are fighting against this brand new formed United States of America government over this tax. So it's not just like, oh, everyone was living in total peace and harmony from 1776 to 1913, and there were no money problems, and there was no government corruption. Like, the second government started, people were already going into violent protest over taxes. So other excise taxes were tobacco and, you know, other sort of like individual goods. And then finally, there's the concept of tariffs, right? They did a lot more in tariffs. That's sort of what Donald Trump is doing now in 2025. He's playing with this idea of, could we get rid of income tax and just replace it with higher tariffs? Well, that's exactly what they did prior to 1913. It just happened to be very inconsistent because now a lot of those prices make it to, individual citizens, and they're very volatile. It's not like it's the exact same amount, because now all of a sudden this massive amount of income is being regulated based on goods that are coming in and out of the country, and that can change. We don't have everything to say over that particular process. They kind of mentions, well, where do highways come from? Again, gasoline tax, when you buy a car, when you register your car, all of these things, those are direct taxes for that. Where does education come from, right? You were mentioning this. Well, that's local property tax. You already pay for schools in your local area by just owning land in that local area. So they make a very, very good case about that you can get by without it. Although some of those examples of like, oh, well, how did we get it before? Well, we can't rediscover Mexico again and steal more land and then sell it off again, right? Like, we've kind of already done that. If we annex Canada and start selling Canada off, maybe that's a way to get back to this. But anyways, to answer the rhetorical, that was the deep dive. That's how the country was able to survive for 200 years, by doing other stuff that's maybe not at our disposal now.
And that money dries up and they had to find new ideas of continuously funding it, and people come up with their own things, like you said, from selling land to tariffs, where you can't just keep finding land, even though now they want to maybe invade Canada and Greenland, right, and go flip those. And if we flip that, we might get a pretty penny back and not have to pay income taxes for another 20 to 30 to 50 years. But eventually, when you have an entity, it's going to be asking for money somehow, some way.
Ripples and waves. How did this movie make an impact? I don't know. Did it? I don't know many people that have actually seen America, Freedom to Fascism, and the fact that Aaron Russo died a year after he released this means that he didn't go on that 10-year, 20-year circuit and keep pushing this and get on the podcast and keep improving on it. So unless you saw it right after it came out, it kind of fizzled away in a little bit. I just remember seeing it because outside of this particular documentary, there was an interview with Aaron Russo, and Aaron Russo claims that he talked to a guy named Nicholas Rockefeller and was invited into this inner circle. That I'll paraphrase this a little bit here, but that he gets invited to join what you might call an Illuminati, and Aaron Russo turns him down. But Nicholas Rockefeller still continues to tell him about all these plans they've got, that apparently he told him prior to 9/11 happening, that they were going to stage this huge event. And, Aaron, you can be part of this club. And Aaron's like, I told him never, I'll never do that. But he still kind of remains friends with them over these years. Without that interview, that I can't remember where I heard that, but this is him talking, like, this is Aaron Russo talking to the camera saying, yes, I was invited by the Rockefellers. They told me about all these plans. They told me about these plans for eugenics and these plans for major conspiracies that you usually just read on internet forums. Here's a guy saying, like, no, that the Rockefeller told me directly himself. And then again, he turns up dead a year later. So all sorts of conspiracy around that. But I think that's the biggest waves for this movie. And that you've got a Hollywood producer that used his credibility, burnt a lot of bridges getting some of these interviews with the actual authorities.
I say it did have influence, though, like maybe not directly with a ton of people watching it, but I think there was certain people that watched it and had enough, like Ron Pauls and G. Edward Griffins. It kind of reignited those liberty movements, the Tea Party movements, resurgence of libertarians in the mainstream, and the Fed. You got back to the Jekyll Isle, Creature of Jekyll Isle. It gave that energy back. I don't know if it influenced particularly of people watching it, but I think it influenced some key members in these liberty movements that actually kept pushing that message forward.
And a note here, maybe this was like one of the overboard things, but I wouldn't really say this is overboard, but there is a very specific moment in this movie when you realize, Oh, I'm just listening to a bunch of old lawyers debate very high level theoretical legal cases with each other and get real passionate about it, but it doesn't really ever return back to the people in that way. Like once it gets into just a bunch of legal theory, it sort of stays in that space for the rest of the documentary.
Definitely, yeah. It doesn't go back and like kind of. That's where I said the speculation, and to me that does go a little overboard. The one of the overboards for me was what you mentioned earlier was definitely the RF, the chips in the chipping you up, right? Like we all know that like that was a process and they did thoroughly about it. Like, and those are all real news clips, and but it never turned out to be that particular. They were close to where they were supposed to be, but they shot over the mark because they probably didn't know the new technologies that were just around the corner.
All right, you got to tell me, sink or swim for you. Where's this one at?
Swim all the way. Very entertaining. Tons of knowledge. And one of the highlights I forgot to mention earlier is I thought them highlighting pretty much the IRS being a gang that could at any time forge documentation on you, raid your house and have you walking out in a little small towel and forcing your kids to hurry up and get dressed. Like it really showed the thug aspect of the IRS, which I don't think is highlighted enough, but has all the greats, man. Every single expert in there to me, like I'm a big Ron Paul guy. I'm a big G. Edward Griffin guy. Seeing them get to break down stuff and really it was thought provoking where we're interjecting, should we be paying taxes? What is income tax? Things that I already, bias on, obviously, like I hate the IRS and I don't want to pay income tax, which I don't know, like you said, who does, but I thought they made great claims, whether it can be interpreted or not, doesn't matter. But I thought the questions that they arose to me personally would make me push further into investigating how can we not pay income taxes.
And no surprise for me, this is definitely a swim too, because in my opinion, you walk away from this documentary learning something new, learning that maybe there isn't a legal definition or any law on the books that unequivocally says that you have to fill out your 1040. Although, again, that doesn't mean I'm not filling mine out because I don't want the feds showing up at my house and making me do a perp walk in a towel in front of all my neighbors, which we've seen will happen to you over and over again. Although they also make a point that I think 3 of the people that we see in this documentary being interviewed that worked for the IRS and then said, I'm not paying my income taxes anymore because I resigned from my position. I saw that it wasn't constitutional. And it shows that they beat some cases brought against them by the IRS. I don't know if I'm ready for that level of commitment where I am actually going up against the IRS in court and hoping that I also get a jury that finds my side of it favorable, because they even make a note that the judge in one of these juries was totally expecting the jury to go out and rule against this person convicted of tax fraud. And they came back and they acquitted. And they said that they didn't find any law that states that you actually had to pay income tax. So clearly even the judge was like, oh yeah, these idiots are going to go straight to jail. So it's very risky. It's risky, and you would be putting yourself at risk by not paying income tax. And they focus on that maybe a little bit too much. And then they kind of gloss over the fact that there was another court case where like 24 people all went to jail for fraud because they didn't have that same stroke of luck. So anyway, definitely a swim, because anything that makes you more interested in reading Creature from Jekyll Island, understanding the 16th Amendment, understanding IRS and the Federal Reserve and how bills are made and all of that is a worthy documentary. So 100% swim. On the horizon is the next conspiracy-themed documentary. It's called A Noble Lie, Oklahoma City, 1995. And the documentary itself is from 2011. That's the name, has 1995 in it. This one, again, is one that will rock anybody's mind the first time that they see it. I'm hoping it rocks your mind a little bit because you mentioned you hadn't seen it before either. So I'm excited about this one. It might even make you even more. If you hate the IRS, now we're going to get you to hate the FBI and the ATF and pretty much everybody else.
Yeah, I'm ready to enjoy that because And then whatever I hate, I'm hoping that I get the luck of stroke and have one of those jurors that sees it my way.
Under the docks, yeah, under the docks. Buried deep, but we're breaking the locks. Footage got clipped, they erase all the shots. Stay connected dots. Under the docks, under the docks, yeah, under the docks. Under the docks.
Illuminati coming. Yeah, Illuminati coming. You know you want it. This Illuminati coming.
Learn about the full history of the Bavarian Illuminati. Adam Weishaupt, Alumbrados, Jesuits, Rosicrucians, Freemasons, and more. From the 18th century to modern day, we expose it all.
Yeah, Illuminati coming. You know you want it. This Illuminati coming.
That's right, it's the Illuminati comic from Donut and Paranoid American. Get yours now at IlluminatiComic.com.
Paranoid. Yo. I scribble my life away, driven to write the page. Will it enlighten your brain? Give you the flight, my plane. Paper the highs ablaze. Somewhat of an amazing feel when it's real to real. You will engage it. Your favorite, of course, the Lord of an arrangement. I gave you the proper results to hit the pavement. If they get emotional, hate, maybe your language, a game, how they playing it well without Lakers. Evade them, whatever the cost, they are the shapeshift. Snakes get decapitated, met is the apex. Execution of flame you out, nuclear bomb distributed at war, rather gruesome for eyes to see. Max them out, then I light my trees. Blow it off in the face, you're despising me for what though? Calculated and rather cutthroat. Paranoid American must be all the blunt smoke for real. Lord, give me a day away, vacate. They wait around to hate whatever they say. Man, it's not in the least bit. We get heavy rotate when the beat hits, so thank us, you're welcome. Fuck the niggas for real, you're welcome. They ain't never had a deal, you're welcome. Man, they lacking appeal, you're welcome. Yet they doing it still, you're welcome.